Οι ερωτήσεις λοιπόν δικές σας και ποιος θα είναι, παρακαλώ.
Thank you. Achilles Saltis from the New York Times. I have a question that probably belongs, as Dora Balkogianni said, to Pythia. But I'm going to throw it out there. Maybe Ian or Adriano, maybe Solly would want to comment on this. I was reading recently Paul Mason's thesis on post-capitalism. I don't know if you came across his book, his article. I mean, it was interesting that he started his thesis by talking about what is happening here in Greece in terms of the sharing economy and how the crisis is changing the labor market. And basically the thesis, as you know, is that we are probably at a historical juncture of moving from, as it was 500 years ago, moving from feudalism to capitalism, and now we're moving from capitalism to post-capitalism in 100 years, God knows how many years from now. I don't particularly like the term post-capitalism, but that's what he says. Do you have any comments on that? Who is the main actor in that? I mean, it's not the landowner. Is it the corporation? And how is the corporation and government going to coexist or forge this new economic system after this unleashing of you know, deregulation from Thatcher and Reagan?
That's a great question, thank you. So I wouldn't go as far as to call it post-capitalism, but it's clear that the hyper-globalized nation states that we have seen in the 1990s and in the early 2000s may have peaked. I'm not saying that from now on it's going to decline, but we may no longer see an hyper-globalized nation state as we have seen. And it's interesting also in the case of the European Union, which was created with the goal of progressively overcoming the nation states, and we see that the nation state simply refuses to go away. And connected to what you were saying about technology, it's clear that automation, robotics present challenges for the labor sector, and that old model of economic growth based on intensive labor is obsolete. And even in China, it has become obsolete as China moves from the production of low-end goods to higher-end goods and even services. And we have a clear example that we have seen over the past decade and a half. First, there were taxi drivers. Then Uber came and threatened all the taxi drivers. But now we have self-driving cars, which are threatening both Uber and the taxi drivers. So, as I said before, education may be a way to deal with this. The states will have to have a role in adapting the education system to the new economy so that workers are not left behind or left aside and can integrate in the new economy. But of course, as I said during my presentation, the middle class will come under threat. And when the middle class feels threatened, then you have economic consequences because, as I say, they are one of the engines of the economy through consumption. But you also have political consequences because, as I said, they vote. And they vote many times, in many cases, for messianic leaders who propose shortcuts to economic development.
Could I
Κυρία Μπακογιάννη, θέλετε κάποιος άλλος θέλει να απαντήσει?
Okay. If you like, just a quick word on this. You know, I think we've been very bad at understanding where the center of gravity in terms of risk and financial flows and so on is actually. I mean, David Smick had a wonderful book about this where he talked about, you know, the sort of everyone focusing on hedge funds. In fact, it turned out that Japanese housewives controlled more investment than all of the hedge funds together. We're very bad at understanding those sources of risk, but I think, in fact, something Soli said may turn out to be very important in thinking this through, kind of what comes next in terms of capitalism. And that is something that may actually look like kind of corporatist capitalism. In other words, if you listen to a lot of the rhetoric, especially from populist politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, they're not really talking about free markets. They're talking about a kind of cozier shaped deal with large economic actors. It's corporatist. We've seen that before. This would be my reading in some ways of the Trump approach to big business. It's not taking the reins off of the you know, the market and just letting it do its thing, is a kind of traditional Republican thought might have it. It's something much cozier. It's something much more corporatist. It's something shaped. And that may be one response to the kind of forces you're talking about.
Κυρία Λίβνη.
I would like to refer also to some of the things that were said, and I don't think that it's the economy stupid. I think that all of us are stupid enough, and we need to understand that maybe we cannot judge the situation of today in accordance to history, because it's a completely different world. You were talking about judges or legal system. I would like to remind you that the President of the United States referred to them as so-called judges. We see this kind of trends against the courts also in Israel and in other parts. The press and the media is not the same and doesn't have the same power. Democracy is not the same. And young people feel that instead of voting, that can be more influential by using the networks. So therefore, I think that the best thing for us to understand, and most of us are part of the establishment that is being hated. So we need to understand that it's a world that is changing, and you referred to Russia and its economy, and how can Russia become more influential? Because there is no vacuum in the world. And when the United States withdraw from the Middle East, Russia is there with its economy, or with its problems in its economy, but yet it's getting more and more influential in the region. And therefore, I believe that since we were talking about identity and economic stuff, maybe it's a combination of both, but we cannot just take just one, as I would not take just the identity part. Because when we are talking about the United States, I think that I can be optimistic or pessimistic if I would know what makes America great again, according to Trump. Because if we are talking about identity, and I know that the explanation is that the people in America voted because of economy stuff, because they felt that the young generation is earning less than them. But talking about Brexit, young people in Britain voted for staying in the EU and not for leaving. So I truly don't understand it anymore. But when it comes to identity, and this is something that I want also to share, it is about and being great again in also being the leader of the free world. It's not just about having a good economy. It's not just about earning a living. It's about being part of leading the world. The identity is also about being strong. This is the meaning of being nationalist. It's not just being isolated, but being strong. And since there is no vacuum, we need to understand that we cannot just take one angle of the situation and say, okay, it's the economy. It's part of this, part of it, and I think that we have less and less understanding. This is the way I feel anyway, about these changes. Also because of technology and because of the changes of the fraction of the talking about the establishment, it is changing.
I would agree with that. But I think the world, and throughout its history, that 4,000-year-old history, goes in cycles. There's never a straight line where one power is completely dominant. At some point, there are two things. First of all, economic exhaustion. You cannot always be the policeman everywhere. And the other thing is getting accustomed to things. People, even if they have a good time, as Aristotle said, at some point they get tired even of the good time and they want to try something different. For example, in Britain, they have it very good. Exactly. That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. People will try for something different and it may end up being much worse than what they had before. And in Britain, they have the best of all worlds in Europe. I mean, they were in really good shape and somehow they decided that this good shape is not good enough. I need to try something else, and it was the working class. And regarding the question of capitalism, I mean, capitalism has existed for 4,000 years in various forms. It was in ancient Athens and in Egypt and in Syria and Babylonia and the Hittites and the Chaldeans. They all had capitalist systems, which means at some point you had a class of poor and a class of rich. And the class of poor was about 10 times more than the class of rich. And every now and then you had huge conflicts in the city of Argos. The class of the poor literally got their clubs out and virtually massacred every rich person in the city of Argos down in the Peloponnese. These things happen throughout history, and they will happen again and again. And now we are at the point where the people who feel they're not getting the benefit of globalization and they see all this richness are revolting in a much more milder way. I mean, revolting by voting Trump or Le Pen is not exactly revolting by massacring. But I think it's a matter of cycles. And this cycle has more to run. I think it has about 3-4 years to run. And from there on, things will stabilize. With the caveat, there are always unexpected things. I mean, something crazy may happen to the South China Sea area, where I think China has managed to make a little bit of a mess, including with its own Asian neighbors. It's not China against America in the South China Sea, where everywhere they find they build airports right in the middle of little islands. They have a problem now. China has a problem with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with Thailand, with India, because they're spreading locally, and the other countries don't accept, but there's nothing they can do. And they look towards Obama in the last few months, and Obama didn't respond. And I don't know how Trump is going to respond. So there are areas of question marks, but everything else is part of a natural cycle that has happened over the past 40 centuries.
First, I really doubt that we are so radically changed. There are still examples to be taken from the past, analytically anyway. First of all, what is unprecedented is peasantry as a social element, as a social class, is disappearing. Now, that is really, truly, historically phenomenal. And we need to deal with urban areas and urban populations. Possibly, we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to reorganize urban areas and stuff. It's not. I'm sure there were a lot of debates whether or not women and children should no longer work for 16 hours in the 19th century. Maybe we should not work for 8 hours again anymore. Secondly, maybe there should be something called basic income, because you cannot provide jobs for everyone who is actually alive in any given sovereign territory. But those are very radical things in the logic of capitalism as it is constituted today. And as I said, will corporations give up on quarterly reports and where their shareholders take a cut? And those are things that only politics can deal with. And in the last 30 years, politics has been too beholden to the interests of capital, which is why the specter of Marx is still with us. And whether or not we deal with it in a more social democratic way or in a Leninist way may very well be the very critical question that we're going to be facing.
So I totally agree with you. At the end of the day, politics, the answer must be political, and only political. Because I hear a lot about post-capitalism, as you rightly mentioned, and I liked very much the example of Uber, which happens to be an issue in Greece now. My party is attacked because we mentioned that Uber exists. So we are not allowed to do that, even by our own people, who they don't understand that how is it possible that when you have the taxi drivers, you are allowed to speak about Uber. But the main problem is a problem of democracy at the end of the day. The delegitimization of democracy and the delegitimization of politics is, in my opinion, the main problem we face today. Because we started with all this, whoever is a politician is an enemy of the people to start with. If he is not an enemy of the people, he is corrupt. If he is not corrupt, he is stupid. And at the end of the day, he is a liar anyway. But that means that the people don't really trust the leadership. So without having a real leadership, you cannot control the capital and the capitalistic way. And if there is an answer, in my opinion, which is needed today, is the political answer to exactly this kind of gap which exists in the whole world, and it exists also in Europe. People cannot understand the example which Petros Doukas brought. They cannot understand how few people have half of the growth, the capital of the world. They don't understand it, and they don't want to understand it. And the answer to that can only be political. So that's why if we have to fight back, it's also to fight back in protecting politics, in protecting democracy, in protecting the way we really believe we want to live with, which means that we take in account the word of the people, and not only the word of the capital.
Ξέρετε, κυρία Μπακογιάννη, όμως, μπορεί να μην αντιλαμβάνονται οι πολίτες της Δύσης πώς γίνεται και ο πλούτος συγκεντρώνεται όλο και στα χέρια λιγότερων. Μπορούν όμως να καταλάβουν ότι δεν παίρνουν το μερίδιο που τους αναλογεί. Και αυτό είναι το ζήτημα, η αντίδραση ενδεχομένως που κάποια στιγμή θα υπάρξει. Αυτό θα πρέπει οι πολιτικοί και με ΙΤΑ και οι πολιτικοί με ομικρον γιώτα να σταθούν περισσότερο πάνω σε αυτό. Παρακαλώ, ο κύριος από το κοινό θέλει μία παρέμβαση να κάνει.
Ευχαριστώ. Ίσως απήντησε κάπως η κυρία Μπακογιάννη. It's a question mainly to Mrs. Livni, sorry. First two words of the panel are power, shift of power. And then we come to the last two words with our power centers. Don't you think that exactly the power centers change today? Because I heard yesterday evening a lecture on the diminishing of the meaning and the importance of the state. Maybe it's true that the state we knew till today is shifting into another, let's say, meaning, idea, entity, whatever. Do you think, what's the role of a politician today in a state, you see, where the power, the central power of the state is diminishing and shifting into something else? I was not clear, probably.
The question was clear. I'm not sure that the answer would be as clear as that. Yes, there is less. I would not say that there is less important to states, but as I said at the beginning of this session, that we have, when we are talking about multipolar world, it's not just different states, but different powers, and some of them are cooperation, as was said also before about holding the world, and unfortunately in our region, and this affects also Europe and the world, also organizations, terrorist organizations that are abusing or exploiting the weakness of some of the leadership and the states in order to, and are using the territory, but for them borders don't count. So for them it's not about states, it's not the kind of conflicts that we have in our region, it's not between states anymore, but it's between states, organizations that are abusing world, and for them what they're trying to do is to change also the nature of the societies more than to change just the establishment or the leadership. Because usually what we used to see as in revolution is changing leadership or changing systems, but now it's about changing something that is not connected directly to the fact that it's about states, but those who are worried about it are the leaders and the state. And this is something that we need to take in consideration. Now, talking about democracies, and I would like to add to what Dora Bakoyannis just said, it's a time in which even democracies are being delegitimized because there is more and more support, and people are looking for strength or strong leaders on the expense of the democratic values. In a way, I used to joke and say that in Israel, people would like to live in a democracy American style with Putin as the president. They are looking for strong leaders that would not take, a democracy very seriously, I would say. And this is something that we need to act together in order to define that democracy is not just system of election. It's a matter of values. And we need to have a better understanding altogether, what does it mean? And I wanted in the past also to have a kind of universal code for democracy, to have a better understanding what does it mean, what we need to defend, what is the role of justice system, what is the role of the press, what is the role of leadership. I failed to do it in the past, but maybe now when things are so changing, maybe this is the time to do so.
Thank you very much, because I think it's the classical state that changes. We knew.
Σας ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Ο κύριος Πλατιάς, παρακαλώ. Θέλει πάνω σε αυτό, νομίζω.
On the issue of the state, I mean, after the end of the religious war with the Treaty of Westphalia, the central unit of the international system was the state. Now the state is under attack, both from above and from below. Below because it cannot meet expectations, it cannot deliver growth, it cannot deliver jobs, it cannot deliver security. And from the pressures of the international systems that are described. So the state now increasingly has competitors, which is a new phenomenon, but not so new. I mean, if you look 100 years or 150 years before Westphalia, Europe around 1500, look what was competing. Big nation states were emerging, France, Spain, England. At the same time, you had the Holy Roman Empire. Then you had the Pope competing for power. Then you had city-states. Then you had the Hanseatic leads. So different units, or you have prominent individuals, bankers that were financing wars, like the Medici. So it was a complete diffusion of power. Before one organizational form, the state, emerging as a winner. And the international system was organized because of the state. Now this thing is dying. And that's precisely what I explained in the diffusion of power. If you look at the international system, for example, only in terms of hard power, yes, you see only unipolarity. But if you look about this power diffusion, you see a completely different system. And that's probably the most important thing which is happening. The states, after so many centuries of centrality, is diminishing its value.
I would like to add one more sentence, because we are talking about these Islamist groups. In a bizarre situation, ISIS, the name, is based on saying, part of it, one of the S is state. It's not a state, but is using as part of the name the word state, but it's not related to a territory. And this is a completely different concept, unfortunately, but this is a completely different concept.
Παρακαλώ.
Feudalism failed many years past because the wealth was concentrated in some landowners' hands and who had servants, etc. And eventually feudalism failed. Capitalism failed because in the end the apparatchiks owned basically all the wealth of the countries that had the communist system, and that system in 70 years basically failed. Capitalism, which is the only system that really can generate wealth, is failing, as we see, because as the Deputy Foreign Minister mentioned, the wealth is concentrated in 40 or 60 or 100 families' hands. So capitalism is failing as well. And all this, control of the wealth in the hands of the few is really creating all these problems that, we see in the world: immigration, the election of Trump, Chrysiavgi in Greece, etc., is creating all these social problems that somehow we need to face. And if capitalism is failing and is going to eventually maybe bring the same scene as in Argos, as the Deputy Foreign Minister mentioned, people will come out with guns to really seek some justice in the social system. In the United States, we see that the Koch brothers spent $100 million to basically elect people locally and nationally that will service their business and their interests, etc., etc., etc. Democracy is diminishing because of this concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. So how are we going to eventually really be able to replace a system that is really generating wealth that could really, if it was equitably divided, it could bring the most amazing times in the 21st century for the people of the world. We have to somehow work towards a new, and it has to be a capitalistic system, but it has to be a new system of capitalism that will eventually be able to equitably distribute the wealth of the world, so it will be more equitability and at the same time more democracy, etc., etc., etc. So I believe that is the main question that we have to answer eventually. If all these systems fail, and if the capitalistic system is the only system that can generate wealth, how do we somehow bring it together to eventually create wealth for everybody and equitably instead of the very, very few that is bringing all these problems worldwide?
Well, let me just give a short answer. There are not only bad news around. There are some radical changes taking place. For example, transparency question, tax havens, agreements which have been signed in the last years in the European Union, which do not allow any more practices of the past. You have for the first time Alibaba paying an astronomical sum because what he was selling was not according to the American laws. So there is an answer, and this answer can only be a political one. When companies have to agree or have to apply with the laws. Of course, it's a problem, but there have been also some positive signs around, which means that the democracies are reacting towards what's happening in the financial world. Is it soon enough? Is it enough anyway? I don't know. It will probably need much more drastic measures. But I think that the societies and the governments, one way or another, are reacting. And I hope they will react more in the future.
Well, I mean, if I may, just, with due respect to the question, I think, in my view here, the economics is, in fact, not the problem. Politics here, I think, forgive the metaphor, trumps economics, because if you look at what is driving a lot of the things that we've been discussing that we all seem very disturbed about, in fact, it's not at base about declining prosperity or any of those things. It's about, I think, a perception of anxiety, which is much more cultural and political than it is economic, actually. Otherwise, migration wouldn't be such a strangely explosive issue on both sides of the Atlantic. I think in some way, unfortunately, Samuel Huntington was right, but maybe not in exactly the way he intended. It's not a clash of civilizations. It's a kind of problem of cultural anxiety, civilizational anxiety at the retail level, at the level of individuals, that is driving a lot of this very destabilizing politics that we're seeing. So I think, frankly, to me, it's about politics rather than economics. But then I'm not an economist, so maybe I would think that. But
I'll give you another short example of what happened in Argos. Something similar happened in the island of Chios, which is very close to the border with Turkey. The poor really literally revolted and executed most of the rich, but some very few rich were still around. So one of the democratic leaders said, leave them alone, because if we destroy all of them, then we'll start shooting at each other. So keep a future enemy there so we don't get a civil war in between us. Now, the open systems, the free market systems and the global systems are bound to generate inequality. It's mathematically definite. Because what happens? If I run against Usain Bolt for 100 meters, he will go 100 meters and I'll be at the 10th meter. So our difference will be 90. If I run against him in the 200-meter sprint, by the time he finishes the 200 meters, maybe I'm done 30 meters. So our difference in the wider space is going to be 170 meters. If I run a mile against him, by the time I run 200 meters, he will have finished the mile. So our difference is going to be 1,400 meters. And if I run the marathon, which is a much wider space, he will finish the 40 kilometers of marathon and I'll be in the 3rd kilometer. So our difference will be 37 kilometers. From the 80 meters, we're going to be different in 37 kilometers. So it's inevitable. And if you start destroying the system because it produces these bad effects, then you will also have increased poverty everywhere. So somehow you need to keep the system which allows for both freedom and productivity and creativity, but ensure, first of all, free education, so people have good access to good free education, a minimum social security fund to pay for the basic social security needs, and a minimum pension. If you're a citizen of Greece, you get, 400 or 500 euros per month of pension, but then I allow those who create wealth to keep on creating wealth so I can give better pensions to the masses. Now still, there will be stress. No matter what happens, you're not going to have a good solution. There is no such thing as good solution because of the nature of people. You just have to prod along and see if you can get, as Dora said, some decent political solutions. None of them will be satisfactory to more than 40%. 60% will be dissatisfied, but they won't be united 60%. There'll be clusters of 5 and 10 percenters. So you just have to plod along. There's no easy solution, and certainly a more socialistic system is not going to be an easy solution because it will reduce the overall level of wealth for all the population.
Παρακαλώ να δώσετε το μικρόφωνο λίγο στο κοινό και θα έρθω σε εσάς, κύριε καθηγητά. Θέλατε κάτι επάνω σε αυτό που στη συνέχεια? Ναι. Ναι.
Εγώ πήγα I went to the United States in 1964. That was the roaring 60s and 70s in the United States. And why was that? In 1929, we had the Great Depression because 1% of the population owned 24.5% of the wealth. In 2008, it was the Great Recession because 1% of the population owned again 24.5%. When I went in 64, it was the roaring 60s and 70s, when 1% of the population owned only 8.5% of the wealth. It was much more money, a bigger pie for everybody to share. One wage earner had a house, wife in the house, car outside, kids in school, some money in the bank. Now to have all those things in the United States, you need 3 or 4 wages. So politically, I don't believe we can go in the United States, at least we cannot go back to the taxation, which at the time was 50 to 75%, until the Reagan years, from the 1950 to the Reagan years, taxation was 50 to 75%. I don't believe that politically anybody can bring taxation up to that number anymore. Therefore, the rich are getting richer. There are no taxes anymore for the government to be able to really help education and health care, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So somehow, the only thing I know as an entrepreneur is that entrepreneurship creates 75% of the employment in the world. From 1 employee to 10 employees, all these small businesses generate 75% of the employment worldwide. And we know of cooperatives in Spain, is Mondragon and a lot of other cooperatives and partnerships that where the worker owns part of the businesses, so they earn a wage plus working hard and smart. They also own part of the companies that are really progressing. And this cannot, happen overnight, of course, as far as I'm concerned, but if we were to really aim at a just system where people who have an equitable opportunity to really create their own jobs and wealth, I believe if the governments of the world and the business people of the world and the communities in the world, we could somehow strategize as to how to enable people to create small businesses, in their neighborhoods, in their towns, in their counties, etc., etc. So eventually, once the people own part of something, they will thrive. They will have an opportunity to thrive. And that is what this present capitalistic system is failing, because it never gave any opportunities. And somehow politically, we are never able to fight the big landowners and the big industrials, etc., 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 because they control the media, they control everything else, etc., etc., etc. They control Washington, they control the capitals of the states, and I'm sure that the same in the world, the same in Greece, and we know that for a fact. So somehow we need to really give ourselves this great opportunity of creating something that we know that it can thrive, because we know cooperatives that thrived worldwide.
Είναι σαφή αυτά που μας επισημαίνετε. Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για τις επισημάνσεις. Να διαχειριστούμε λίγο το χρόνο, γιατί μας πιέζει αυτή τη στιγμή. Έχω 2 ερωτήσεις στο κοινό και μετά έρχομαι σε εσάς για να ολοκληρώσουμε. Παρακαλώ.
First of all, thank you for the panelists for their riveting insights and views. My name is Konstantinos Kanelopoulos, and I'm a Stavros Niarchos Fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And I have a question on the future of the liberal order in the Western world. The twin events that shocked the world in 2016, the shocking electoral victory of Donald Trump in the United States, and the decision of the British people, the sovereign decision of the British people to leave the EU, indisputably represent a radical transformation of the world that was built after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Timothy Ayrton Gash calls this the post-wall era. We could say this is the end of history. As voters on both sides of the Atlantic are choosing to go towards populism and openness, liberalism, and democracy are under siege, fewer people believe in the transatlantic values, the vitality of the transatlantic relationship, and the indisputable role of the liberal order. To what extent do the panelists agree with Joschka Fischer's statement that this might represent the end of the West and the liberal economic order? And with that being said, do you agree with the fact that the decision of President Obama to go to Germany after Greece in his symbolic message, and the message that was delivered by Angela Merkel to Donald Trump in his election, is Angela Merkel the natural heiress of the Atlantic Charter? Thank you. The natural heiress of the Atlantic Charter.
Well, you ask a very, very good question. And I come from an organization that works on transatlantic relations, so we think about this problem a lot. I think part of the problem, frankly, is simply the vocabulary of liberal international order, which for us here maybe is not a shocking vocabulary, but for much of the world, when you utter that phrase, they sort of recoil on left, on right, and certainly for most people, average people who are not part of the sort of policy elite, they don't know what you're talking about. So this is part of the problem. I mean, it has been an elite discourse in a very stable setting, as we've been talking about, which is now broken down. I think part of the problem is that it does need champions. Transatlantic relations need champions. Europe, the European project, if you like, all of these things need champions, but the charismatics are all on the margins. And if you listen to what the President of the Commission said the other day, it was very sensible and all the rest of it, but it was hardly inspiring. And, you know, there are just a lack of champions for this kind of very sensible, tolerant, cohesive, cooperative kind of model, which we all like. I think at the end of the day, you know, it's not an easy thing to grow a new generation of transatlantic leaders who are capable of making that kind of, you know, very stark but very compelling argument. And I don't think you fix that overnight. Mind you, I mean, the two things that you mentioned, in a sense, are accidents. They were very close-run things. If you changed one little variable in each of them, probably, we would be having a totally different conversation here, possibly.
Thank you, madam. Thank you, madam. I would like to touch upon the North Atlantic Alliance a bit, because I have the impression that one of the factors contributing to the confusion we are facing today is also the fact that this NATO alliance for decades now looks for finding its new raison d'etre, its new mission. And we have great difficulties in that. And I just read very recently an article by George Friedman who says that the alliance has become an alliance of habit. It no longer has a clear purpose, and when some members, like the USA, for instance, become involved in wars, the participation is elective. It can be broad in, if you want, in numbers or in words, but it is militarily insignificant. So how far away are we from President Trump's remark that NATO is obsolete? I don't know the answer.
Well, that's a provocative question, and I'm tempted to answer. Of course it's obsolete because there is no geopolitical threat like it used to be. So NATO, all these years, tried to find a different way, becoming from a military alliance to a political institution, really facilitating former red countries to become blue. So it makes perfect sense. So the obsolete of NATO, obsolescence was already there. But returning to that question, the end of liberal order, it's not only because of populism, it's because of globalization, it's because of all of the retreat of international institutions. So what you say, it's only a part of the picture. So I agree with you, but it's more complicated. There are 4 trends converging, not just one, populism. Now, on your second point about the decline of the West, I don't buy that argument. I mean, these books about the West and the rest and all these things, the only thing that they point out is some statistical data that, of course, the rest, there is some shift of power toward the rest. But the rest are not united. I mean, the rest are not united against the West. For example, India, it's balancing China in the area. So, and India is not West and it's rising. So you cannot say it's the end of the West. Actually, with all the centers of power and the diffusion of power, the West has more instruments to play. And I mean, to go the argument a little further, is it really power what it matters, or how resilient are these powers? I talk about the emerging China. China is emerging, but also very fragile and very vulnerable. So if you look at one dimension, you get into wrong conclusions. By no way the West is over. Simply, it has competitors.
I think that the West is not willing, or is not willing to not to invest, but to pay the price of keeping our own values. And this is what happened, and also the US and the people in the US need to understand that there's a price for being the leader of the free world. Now while we are talking, there's a massacre going on in Syria that, I mean, when Daesh start cutting heads off and putting these pictures and nothing happened, the meaning was that the West is not willing to pay any price to be the leader or to keep these values. And this is something that we need to understand, and this relates also to NATO, to the relationship, to everything.
2 πολύ σύντομες ερωτήσεις έχουμε χρόνο. Μία που οφείλουμε στο κοινό και έρχομαι σε εσάς για να ολοκληρώσουμε.
Thank you very much. I'm Sotis Kopatsaris. I'm a student at Imperial College London. And 2 weeks ago, I'll be very short on this, but this is really spectacular. 2 weeks ago, I was in Dubai representing the Imperial College at the World Government Summit. A spectacular event with speakers like Christine Lagarde and so on, and Professor Stiglitz, Elon Musk. Everybody was talking about the exact same things this panel is addressing. And this is spectacular because you have two completely different countries being alarmed about Trumpism, being alarmed by economic protectionism, and so on. We had the chance there to deliver a presentation about what we think the future of government should be, together with other universities from Harvard, Stanford, and so on. And ultimately, we think it boils down to two things. Civil engagement, that's one big aspect that's actually failing currently, and efficiency of governance. And the question to the panel is, are current governments good enough? We have the exact same model of governance for the last 100 years. Everything else has literally changed. And the only thing that is resilient to change, that is not actually adapting to anything, is the current model of governance. And people are not happy about this. 50% of people do not engage in politics anymore. They don't even vote. So I'd like to ask the panel two questions. Well, one question with two different parameters. The first thing is, how do we make governments effective? And the second question is, would the universal pay system that we proposed at Dubai, for example, enable more civil engagement? Would they make citizens engage more, especially the citizens that are left out of the equation of this whole system of automation and so on? So what do you think should be done to make governments fashionable again? And what do you think should be done to engage citizens again? We think that's the two key aspects. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rosell.
Not directly to this, I want to comment on what Ms. Livni said, because it relates to something that I had in mind I wanted to say. When Henry Kissinger, both in his New World or the New Book and also the World Restored book, talks about an international system's the most important requisite for the international system to work is legitimacy. An international system doesn't have to be fair, but it's got to be legitimate. But precisely because it is the United States that broke whatever existed in the Middle East with this very ill-fated and ill-thought-of Iraq war, its inactivity or activity in Syria would not have really mattered, would not have really changed anything. And that those are precisely the things, going to Iraq and not doing anything in Syria, that broke down the very legitimacy of the order of which the United States was meant to be the custodian. We cannot repair that very easily. Secondly, we should not brag about the values thing, because we have had plenty of contradictions, which are natural in the international system, between the values we presumably uphold and what we do on the ground. And so in a way, the West has broken its own machine itself. And how that will be repaid, I have really no idea. It's like the domestic part of the equation, and but acknowledging it, in my judgment, is really the prerequisite for starting to repair it.
Thank you. Κύριε Δούκα, μια απάντηση στον κύριο.
I think in a democracy, you also have the freedom of high expectations. People are free to nag and to expect much more from the political system than is available. So you will never have satisfaction, as you never had satisfaction. I don't think there was any country in any time in history where people declared that they were satisfied with what they got. One possible solution would be, first of all, to give more power to regions and have regions have their own parliament and their own senate, and to assure that the political system cannot be the same for more, let's say, than 4 elections, 16 years. If you start having politicians being there for 16, 20, 25, 30, 40 years, as sometimes we have in Greece, then I think that's a recipe for failure. Refreshing the system as much as possible is one way out of it, but you will never get real satisfaction. It has never happened unless you have a dictator and people are happy to be alive and not to be killed by the dictator. So they are satisfied in that respect, or watching everybody else suffering equally. That's also a source of satisfaction. But in a democratic system where things are open and some people can move faster, and you can have the freedom of complaining without recourse, it's going to be very, very difficult. My system would be to have greater refreshment much more frequently by changing members of parliament, maximum after 16 years, and having more systems of senates and House of Representatives at the regional level, so more people get involved.
Και η τελευταία μας ερώτηση, παρακαλώ.
I do not have a question. However, I would like to confront several of the statements that were made here. Normally, I'm the pessimist in the room. However, in this context, I'm not. There were statements here like disintegration of the state. State in most Western countries controls directly or indirectly something like 50% of the output produced in the country. Regulates everything up to the flushing of the toilets, as President Juncker mentioned, and so on. Do we really believe these statements that the state is disintegrating? Second, capitalism is collapsing. No system is eternal. In fact, economic historians place the origins of capitalism in the 16th century, not in the 4,000 years that you mentioned before. Anyway, I'm not an economic historian myself, however, most of them place it there. Crisis is something that is part of capitalist system. And in fact, if you see, let's say, all the evidence that is available, in the period after the World War II, crises are far milder than what they used to be in the past. As I mentioned before, systems are not eternal. However, if we had somebody from that time living together, they would not recognize the system. The adaptation and transformation of the system has been really enormous. End of labor. Exactly 205 years ago, Lord Byron gave his first speech in the House of Lords. And he defended the Luddites. We had exactly the same arguments as the ones that we have here. Machines are stealing our jobs. We have the destruction of our society, etc., etc. Did it happen in the next 200 years and so on? No. Is it going to happen now? I have the feeling that adaptation, we will say again, there. And fortunately, we are living in societies where there is deliberation and decision and so on. Concentration of wealth. It is true that concentration of wealth, the evidence that provided by Petros Doukas was correct. Does this imply that we have an increase in global inequality? The answer is emphatically no. If we are looking at the distribution of income of all the citizens of the world, precisely because we had high growth rates in China, India, etc., in several other countries, the world distribution of income nowadays is far more equal than it used to be 20 or 30 years ago. Stagnation of the middle class. This is something that is observed in very, very few countries. The evidence is extremely flimsy. It concerns only money incomes. If we see, in the same time, what kind of transfers the state is doing in kind to the citizens, this statement is completely false. Global inequality, as I mentioned before, it declines. It does increase within countries. Is it an eternal phenomenon? They used to say the same thing in the period of robber barons. However, we saw that there were several interventions there, and this thing was mitigated. Finally, all these things about migration. If you look at the history of humanity, it is a history of migrations. It is not a new phenomenon. It is not something that we can avoid anyhow. The only question is that it is happening too fast and somehow uncontrolled, although most migrations were uncontrolled. Thank you.
Shortly to your question about how we change, how we make people more involved, I believe that since people are voting, or less and less are voting because they feel that they can use the social networks to be more influential, and secondly, they vote for people just for being famous. Have the governments being part of their life and them being more involved on the daily life. We have the technology to do so, but I think that we are thinking still in terms of coming one after in 4 years to vote, you know, in a piece of paper. The world is changing and we need to adapt, and maybe this can regain trust between the leaders and the people.
Epilogos.
No, I can't.
Yes,
just on the technology versus labor force debates, I agree with you that every time that a new technology arises, there are questions about the impact that it will have on workers. I would just say that, as I said before, of course, education remains the key to allow people to enter and to continue benefiting from the workforce. But the big difference this time around is demographic change. We've never had that before. Not even when Byron was speaking, British women were having 8 children. So what I'm trying to say here is that the new challenge will be fiscal. You will have fewer people paying taxes. Countries will have to redesign their pension systems. Countries will have to find a way to deal with this massive amount of people who are neither working nor paying work-related taxes, and that's when the challenges come. It's not just technology alone.
Επίλογος λοιπόν, η παγκόσμια δυναμική αλλάζει, οι πολιτικοί οφείλουν να εφαρμόσουν αποτελεσματικές πολιτικές, ευθύνη όμως τη διαμόρφωση αυτών των πολιτικών έχουμε όλοι καθώς πηγαίνουμε στην κάλπη. Σας ευχαριστώ θερμά όλους.